Dad's been suffering from an old neurological injury that's more recently been causing akathisia. Akathisia is the worst thing I've ever seen anyone go through. That sounds dramatic, but it's true.
He spent his life teaching millions how to look at hard things without flinching. His whole philosophy came down to one idea: facing the truth, even the ugly, inconvenient parts of it, is the only way to build anything worth having. He told young men to stand up straight. He told broken people to carry their burdens instead of running from them. He told those who are fearful that courage is not the absence of fear. Rather, it is the refusal to let fear dictate your decisions. For decades, Jordan Peterson was the guy who seemed to have already looked into the abyss and come back with notes. Then, in the summer of 2025, something in his body gave out. His daughter Mikhaila stood in front of a camera and used a word that no amount of philosophy could soften. Hellish. That's the word she used. It's the truth her father could no longer hide, and she could no longer keep quiet. The man who built a career on refusing to hide anything was, for weeks, simply gone. Not resting. Not by choice. Gone in the way a person is gone when the body stops listening, and the machine that carried a whole life just gives out underneath it. What happened to Jordan Peterson? How did the world's most famous teacher of resilience end up fighting for his life in an ICU, unable to speak to his own family? And what did his daughter reveal that even his most devoted followers weren't ready to hear? Have you ever watched someone you thought was unbreakable quietly come apart? Tell us in the comments, because that's really what this whole story is about. But before we get to that hospital room, we should go back to where the story started. Jordan Peterson's collapse in 2025 did not happen suddenly. It was the result of events that began decades earlier. It began decades earlier in a small, frozen town where a kid with too many questions decided that truth was worth carrying, however heavy it got. Jordan Peterson wasn't born into privilege. He was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta, and raised in Fairview, a small, weather-beaten town in Alberta's far northwest, the kind of place where the winters are long enough that endurance isn't optional. His father, Walter, was a schoolteacher. His mother, Beverly, worked as a librarian at the local college campus. They weren't wealthy or well-connected, but they gave him something rarer: books, in a town where the horizon stretched empty in every direction. A school librarian named Sandy Notley, whose daughter Rachel would later become Premier of Alberta, put into the hands of a teenage Peterson the kind of books most adults never get around to: Solzhenitsyn, Orwell, Huxley, and Rand, writers who stared straight at the machinery of totalitarianism and cruelty and refused to look away. Peterson, barely old enough to drive, read them all, and something in those pages stuck. What book, or what single idea, first made you realize the world was more complicated than you'd been told? Drop it in the comments. For Peterson, the answer rerouted his whole life. As a teenager, he joined the New Democratic Party, the political left, with the idealism of someone who believed the right system could fix a broken world. But the more he studied ideology and how well-meaning people in the 20th century built systems that ended in catastrophe, the more he wondered whether the real question wasn't which party was right, but why people keep choosing cruelty, even while convinced they're building paradise. He left the party at 18. He earned a degree in political science at the University of Alberta, then went back for a second one in psychology. He pursued his doctorate at McGill University in Montreal under Robert O. Peel, a leading researcher in addiction and aggression. His thesis examined the psychological markers behind alcoholism. He finished his PhD in clinical psychology in 1991. From 1993 to 1998, Peterson taught and researched at Harvard. He wasn't famous or controversial yet, just a serious, intense academic. One of his students there, novelist Greg Hurwitz, has credited him as the most influential teacher he ever had. In 1998, Peterson returned to Canada and joined the University of Toronto faculty. He kept a private clinical practice and began building lectures on mythology, psychology, and the structures that hold meaning together. In 1999, he published Maps of Meaning, a book that took him 13 years to write and, at first, barely sold enough copies to fill a living room. For 20 years, Peterson did what academics do: taught, treated patients, published research, and built ideas slowly. Then, in September 2016, he uploaded a set of videos to YouTube titled "Professor Against Political Correctness." In them, he said he'd refuse to use government-mandated gender-neutral pronouns with students or faculty. Canada's Parliament was preparing to pass Bill C-16, which would add gender identity and expression as protected categories under the Human Rights Act. Peterson argued that compelling someone to use specific language under legal threat crossed a line free societies shouldn't cross and called it compelled speech. The university pushed back. Student activists confronted him on campus. Faculty unions condemned him. And the internet exploded. Within a year, his Patreon income had grown dramatically, and letters poured in from around the world, many from young men, saying some version of the same thing. "I thought I was the only one who felt this way." Do you think a person should ever be legally required to use specific words, or does that cross a line for you? That question split a country and launched one of the more unlikely careers in modern intellectual life. Peterson didn't back down. By 2018, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos came out. It wasn't an academic book or a manifesto. It was something rarer, a serious book written in language ordinary people could actually read. It has since sold more than 10 million copies. He toured the world, debated philosophers and journalists, and his podcast conversations racked up millions of views. The New York Times named him one of the most influential public intellectuals in the Western world. But that kind of reach doesn't come free. He was called a fascist by some and a prophet by others, and neither label had much to do with the man behind the desk. His words were clipped and recontextualized by people on every side of every argument. And underneath the schedule, something was starting to give. Starting in 2016, after what he described as a severe autoimmune reaction, Peterson restricted his diet to meat and a narrow list of vegetables to manage an autoimmune disorder and depression. By 2018, he'd cut out the vegetables entirely. It helped with some symptoms, but it also isolated him from the ordinary rhythms of eating and socializing. Meanwhile, his wife, Tammy, had just been diagnosed with Bellini duct carcinoma, a rare and aggressive kidney cancer that doctors initially called terminal. Peterson was carrying global fame in one hand and his family's survival in the other, and almost no one in his audience knew it. In 2019, Jordan Peterson fell apart. Not in the slow, manageable way public figures sometimes stumble, but completely, privately, while the world kept quoting his rules. It had started with something that seemed reasonable enough. Around 2016 or 2017, a physician prescribed him clonazepam, a benzodiazepine used for anxiety, at a low dose to help with the physical toll of his restrictive diet and his suddenly massive public life. It seemed to help. Then, in April 2019, after Tammy's diagnosis, his dose was increased, and something in his body responded in a way nobody predicted. Benzodiazepine dependence doesn't announce itself with a dramatic break. It creeps. It rewires the brain's ability to regulate fear and calm, so the anxiety the drug was meant to suppress comes back amplified. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines is, by clinical consensus, among the most physically dangerous and psychologically brutal processes the nervous system can go through. Peterson tried to stop. What followed was a period he's only ever described in fragments. Have you ever been let down by the very thing that was supposed to help you? A habit? A medication? A belief that worked until it didn't? That's roughly where Peterson found himself. Meanwhile, Tammy's cancer had come back. Peterson was managing his own collapse while watching his wife fight for her life, all while his public career kept demanding appearances and interviews from a man who was privately falling apart. By late 2019, his family made a decision that made headlines. They flew him to Moscow. North American doctors, the family said, wouldn't provide the treatment they wanted. A medically induced coma meant to let his nervous system reset without the conscious experience of withdrawal. It was unconventional and controversial. But conventional treatment had already failed. In Russia, doctors found he'd developed pneumonia in both lungs. The induced coma went ahead anyway. For 8 days, Jordan Peterson was unconscious in a Moscow hospital. He spent 4 weeks in intensive care afterward and lost significant motor function. He couldn't walk normally, and his coordination was badly compromised. His family moved him to Serbia for further rehabilitation, and for months he disappeared from public life. He reappeared in June 2020, gaunt and visibly changed, on his daughter Mikhaila's podcast, recorded in Belgrade. He said he was back to himself. Those who watched closely weren't so sure that was true. He had been to the edge of what a human body can take and come back knowing the edge is real. It doesn't negotiate, not even for the man who spent his career writing rules for surviving it. By late 2020 and into 2021, Peterson was slowly re-emerging. Lectures, podcasts, and interviews, one at a time. What the public didn't fully see was how fragile things still were behind it. Tammy's cancer had briefly been called terminal. She underwent treatment and endured what treatment like that requires, and in a way her doctors struggled to explain, the trajectory shifted. She survived, though not easily and not without cost. Jordan carried that awareness back into his work. In 2021, he published Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, a more personal book than its predecessor, wrestling with the idea that too much order becomes its own kind of prison. He later resigned from the University of Toronto after decades in academia, joined the Daily Wire as a podcaster and commentator, and co-founded Peterson Academy, an online education platform, with his daughter Mikhaila serving as CEO. He and Tammy relocated to Paradise Valley, Arizona, citing frustration with what he called an increasingly hostile political environment in Canada. In the summer of 2025, Peterson was helping clean out his father-in-law's house after a death in the family, an ordinary task that turned out to matter more than anyone realized. The room was contaminated with mold, the kind that colonizes water-damaged buildings and releases biotoxins that certain immune systems, especially ones already worn down by years of stress and prior illness, can't defend against. Within weeks, something in Peterson's body broke open. He was eventually diagnosed with chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CRS, a condition in which the immune system, triggered by biotoxin exposure, goes into a state of chronic overreaction and starts attacking the body itself. The inflammation escalated fast. By late summer, CRS had progressed into pneumonia, and the pneumonia progressed into sepsis. Peterson was rushed into emergency hospitalization and spent nearly a month in intensive care, unable to communicate with his own family for much of that time. Mikhaila Peterson was the one who gave the world updates, and she didn't soften them. She described her father's condition as a near-death experience and called the weeks leading up to it exceedingly difficult and terrifying. On the same day her father was hospitalized, her own newborn daughter was also rushed to the hospital with a cardiac crisis. 2 generations of the same family, fighting for their lives on the same day. Inside the ICU, doctors identified critical illness polyneuropathy, nerve damage from the combination of severe infection and prolonged inflammation, which affected Peterson's motor function. By October 2025, he'd stabilized enough to leave intensive care, but he stayed hospitalized for continued treatment until December. In December, his family confirmed he'd returned home to Paradise Valley. He was alive. He wasn't well. Mikhaila said her father wasn't doing well, though not as badly as he had been. She asked people for prayers and patience. "We are waiting, hoping, and praying for recovery," she said. As of early 2026, Peterson is at home in Paradise Valley, out of the hospital, with a team of specialists managing his ongoing neurological complications and the systemic inflammation CRS tends to leave behind. His daughter describes his progress as gradual and uneven, with better days and worse days. What do you do when the tools that carried you your whole life aren't enough anymore? When does the philosophy that worked stop working? Tell us in the comments, because it's a question most people end up facing in some form eventually. What's left, without the lectures and the world tours, is quieter. Mikhaila visits every day, sometimes for hours. Peterson Academy has kept growing without him at the center of it, and Peterson reportedly watches its courses now, from home, in the quiet of recovery. Tammy is with him, 35 years of marriage, and the thing that outlasted every controversy and health crisis is the plain fact of two people choosing to stay. His son Julian and his grandchildren are there too. The people who knew Jordan Peterson before the world did are the ones around him now. Of everything in this story, what surprised you most? The Russia chapter, the mold exposure, or the word his daughter used, hellish? Let us know below. Jordan Peterson spent his career arguing that suffering isn't an obstacle to a meaningful life so much as the mechanism of it, that picking up the burden you didn't choose and carrying it anyway is close to the best thing an ordinary person can do. He's living that argument now, not from a stage, in a house in Arizona, on the days when just getting up is hard. If this story affected you, leave a like, subscribe for more stories like it, and tell us in the comments what's one rule from Jordan Peterson's life, not from his books, that you'll carry with you? Keep going, even when the rules aren't enough, especially then.